Title: Whispers of the Crawling Dark. Chapter 1. The Whisper. Beneath the walls. Ethan's apartment was small, nothing more than a modest one-bedroom with chipped wooden floors and peeling wallpaper, but it had been his sanctuary for the last 2 years. He had always liked the quiet, the isolation. The world beyond his apartment had always been a blur, too fast, too bright, too much noise. But in here, within the 4 fading walls, he could retreat, let the world pass by. That was, until it started. It began on a Tuesday night, just after the rain had stopped. Ethan had been sitting at his desk, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside him. He had long since stopped writing, the pressure of deadlines mounting against him, but the hum of the apartment, the rhythmic sound of the dripping faucet, and the occasional creak of the old building was oddly comforting. Until the sound came, a soft scraping, like something sharp running against the wall. A whisper of movement, too quiet for the human ear to catch, yet still, there it was. A sound that belonged neither to the creaks of old wood, nor the settling of the house. Ethan turned his head, half expecting to see the shadows of the room shift, the atmosphere thickening around him, but nothing. No sign of movement, no flicker in the dim light overhead. It was just him and the stillness, the only sound his own breathing, ragged now, as though the air had grown heavier. The scraping came again, louder this time. Ethan's eyes snapped to the wall across from him. His gaze traced the narrow gaps between the old boards, the imperfections in the paint. He could feel his heart beating faster, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. A low hum, deep in his chest, thrummed in response to the unnatural noise. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He stood, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and moved cautiously toward the wall. Each step seemed to echo, the apartment too quiet, the air too thick. His mind raced through logical explanations, pipes expanding and contracting, the old building settling, but none of those seemed to make sense. The scraping came again, sharper, closer. Ethan's hand reached out to touch the wall, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the wallpaper. He leaned in closer, squinting as though to peer through the thickness of the wall itself. The noise was right there, behind it. He could feel it vibrating against his skin, a rhythmic pulse, as if something was alive. For a moment, nothing. The scraping stopped. The stillness crept back in. Then, a voice. A faint whisper, so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind, if not for the strange, crawling sensation it left in his bones. Ethan. His name. It was his name, clear and distinct, as though it were spoken just inches from his ear, though no one was there. His heart froze, the blood draining from his face. He spun around, a frantic search of the empty apartment, his breath shallow. There was no one. The silence was suffocating now, thick and pregnant with an unseen presence. Ethan stumbled back from the wall, his eyes wide, searching the room with growing panic. The soft whispering came again, this time more insistent, more filled with an unmistakable hunger. "Ethan, we are waiting." The voice wasn't kind. It wasn't warm. It was an empty, malevolent sound, layered with an inhuman quality. As if something ancient and forgotten had awoken, calling out to him through the thin veil of reality. He staggered backward, crashing into his desk. His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. He was just tired, stressed, too much caffeine. The rational explanations flooded back, one after another, but they couldn't quite reach the center of his fear. Something was wrong here. Something was terribly wrong. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. But the room felt different now, as though it had grown larger or maybe smaller. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer, as though alive, creeping toward him, hungry for something he couldn't name. He looked at the wall again. The small gap between the boards had widened just a little, but the distortion was subtle, so subtle that it could be ignored. Or perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks on him, yet the dread in his chest refused to let him believe that. "Get a grip," Ethan muttered to himself, wiping his palms on his jeans. He grabbed the desk chair, attempting to steady himself, but the tremor in his hands wouldn't stop. But then the floor creaked beneath him. A heavy, wet sound followed, like something crawling through the walls. His eyes darted toward the corner where the sound seemed to originate. The shadows there were darker now, as though they had thickened, as if the very air had begun to bend and warp around them. The hairs on his neck stood on end. The sound grew louder, closer. Suddenly the scraping resumed, but this time it wasn't from the walls. It was from below, from the very floor beneath him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The sounds were unmistakable now. Skittering, like claws. No, like legs. Scratching and tapping against the wood, moving in rapid bursts as if something had been disturbed. His breath came in ragged gasps. Something was alive. Something was inside the walls. He bolted for the door, but as he reached for the handle, the apartment lights flickered and went out. The room was consumed by a thick, choking darkness. The door, too, seemed to mock him now. No matter how hard he twisted the handle, it was stuck. The room was no longer still. It moved with an unnatural rhythm, as though the walls themselves were shifting, pulsing to the beat of a foreign heartbeat. Ethan backed away, his pulse racing, his chest tight. The scratching, skittering sound grew louder. Something was coming, and it was coming for him. Chapter 1. The Whisper Beneath the Walls. Continued. The darkness in Ethan's apartment was suffocating. The air was thick, as though it had taken on a life of its own, curling around him like a cold, oppressive fog. His heartbeat pulsed in his ears, each thud a reminder that he was alone, trapped perhaps, for the first time in his life, in a place that was no longer just unfamiliar, but hostile. The walls that once felt like safe boundaries now seemed like prison bars, closing in. He stood motionless in the center of the room, every muscle in his body taut, unwilling to move or even breathe too loudly. The silence, once a companion to his solitude, now felt alien, empty, suffocating. The only sound that remained was the rapid beat of his own heart. Then the floor creaked again. Ethan's head snapped toward the source, his eyes scanning the shadows, but they revealed nothing. It wasn't just the floor, though. The walls, they were alive. A subtle movement rippled through them, like a breath held too long, released in one soft exhale. The air smelled different now. It was no longer the stale odor of old wood and dust that filled his apartment, but something far worse, something fetid, damp, and decayed, as though the very foundations of the building were rotting beneath him. His stomach lurched, and he fought back the urge to vomit. And then came the sound again, the skittering, scraping noise. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from beneath the floor. The sound was unmistakable, like claws scraping against stone, or the movement of something small but fast, something far too large to be ignored. With a low, primal growl, it began to grow louder. Ethan's body froze, but his mind raced. What was it? Some kind of animal? A rat? A roach? No, this was different. This wasn't the sound of any creature he knew. This was something else, something ancient, malevolent, something that had no place in his world. The scraping stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. The sound of something shifting, something huge, began beneath the floorboards. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the scratching intensified. The walls seemed to hum with it, vibrating as if they were amplifying the noise. There was a distinct wetness to it now, a thick, fleshy noise that felt wrong, unnatural. He backed away from the epicenter of the noise, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the door handle once more. The door wouldn't budge, it was stuck. His chest tightened, and a cold sweat began to bead on his forehead. The movement beneath the floor grew more erratic, more frantic. A low growl escaped from somewhere deep in the walls, vibrating through the floor like a living thing. The walls themselves were shifting now, bending and warping as though they were made of clay, not wood and plaster. There was no denying it. Something was inside. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he turned and ran toward the window. He tugged at the window pane with all his strength, but it was stuck too. The glass felt cold under his fingers, mocking him as he struggled to open it, to escape. The air was thick now, so thick that he could taste it, metallic, bitter. Then, In the midst of the chaos came the voice again. Ethan. It was softer this time. Almost a whisper, but unmistakably clear. The voice was calm, as if it had been waiting, patient, for him to realize something. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat, a cold shiver running down his spine. He spun around, eyes wide with panic, but saw nothing. There was only the darkness, the ever-growing shadows in every corner of the room. The scraping stopped, and in its place, an oppressive silence hung like a thick veil. "You can't leave," the voice murmured, as if the walls themselves were speaking to him. It wasn't just a voice. It was a feeling. A weight pressing against his chest, stealing the air from his lungs. His eyes darted toward the farthest corner of the room. The shadows there had deepened, stretching across the walls like fingers reaching out to claim him. A horrible sensation settled in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't alone here. He never had been. And that was the moment when Ethan realized he had never truly been in control of his own apartment. No. This place, this thing, was far older than he was. Far more ancient than the building itself. It had been waiting for him to come, waiting for him to feel the pull. His eyes narrowed. Was it calling him? A sudden crashing sound came from behind him, sharp and violent. The desk, the same desk where he had sat hours ago, trying to concentrate on his work, was now shaking violently. The sound of wood cracking echoed in the air, as though the furniture was coming to life, the legs of the desk buckling and splintering under some unseen weight. The lamp overhead flickered, casting erratic shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls. The light buzzed, strained, then died. The room was plunged into darkness, and for the first time Ethan truly felt it. The eyes upon him. A cold, damp breeze swept through the room, the chill biting his skin like fingers grazing his flesh. It carried with it the unmistakable stench of decay. But this time, it wasn't just the smell. It was as if the very air itself had turned putrid, fouling his lungs with every breath. Ethan's mind raced, adrenaline pumping, as he realized just how utterly trapped he was. In the suffocating silence, the voice spoke again, slower this time, with a dark satisfaction. "You are already part of it." The words slithered into his ears, chilling his bones, sending a ripple of terror through him. His thoughts clouded over, his body frozen in place, as if the very walls were pressing in on him, forcing him to listen, to understand. The walls creaked, the floors groaned, and then, like the quiet of the grave, 1,000 tiny sounds filled the room, like the soft, echoing skitter of legs, of claws, of things moving in the dark. The shadows in the corners were no longer still, but swaying, curling into shapes that didn't belong, shapes that didn't follow the laws of nature. And then, suddenly, they were there, two glowing eyes in the blackness, staring at him from the far corner of the room. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The thing in the corner wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was something else. Something from a place far darker than anything Ethan had ever imagined. He turned, instinctively looking for the door again, but it was gone. The walls had shifted. The hallway that had once led to the exit was now sealed, just like the window. He was surrounded, trapped. The thing spoke, its voice low, gurgling. It sounded like death itself. "There's no way out, Ethan. You belong to us now." And just like that, Ethan understood. He wasn't alone in the apartment anymore, and he wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 2. Echoes beneath the floorboards. Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, the weight of the night pressing down on his chest like an iron vise. The events from the previous hours were too surreal to be believed, yet they gnawed at the edges of his mind, refusing to be dismissed as figments of his imagination. He tried to rationalize, to calm himself with reason. It was just a dream, a nightmare. The walls creaking, the whispers, the heavy sensation that clung to the air. It was all a trick, a play of his exhausted mind. He had only moved into this apartment a few days ago, after all. It was normal to feel unsettled, wasn't it? Yet as he sat there in the near darkness, his thoughts twisted and writhed, much like the shadows that clung to every corner of the room. The feeling of being watched hadn't left him. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a hollow emptiness that tugged at his insides. Someone was still there, lurking just beyond his vision. The walls weren't silent anymore. The low hum from the previous night had returned, subtle at first, like the distant murmur of wind, but Ethan knew better than to ignore it. He stood up, his breath shallow, and walked toward the source of the noise. The far wall where the shadows seemed to grow unnaturally thick was the center of it all. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and pressed them against the cold, damp surface of the wall. At first, nothing happened. Then the faintest vibration met his touch. So light, he thought he imagined it, but the wall gave a groan, like a voice trying to speak from beneath the surface. The vibration turned into a rhythmic pulse, deep and unsettling. Ethan recoiled, heart racing, as the floor beneath him seemed to shift, causing him to lose his balance for a moment. Was it the house settling? His mind desperately searched for an explanation, but deep down, he knew better. This wasn't a simple foundation issue. Something else was at play, something far darker. Ethan stepped back from the wall, his thoughts racing. He glanced at the door, locked tight. He glanced at the windows, sealed. He was trapped in a room where the very air felt suffocating, and the space itself seemed to shift, as though it was not bound by the same rules of physics that governed the world outside. Then, something caught his attention. From beneath the floorboards, a faint noise emerged, almost imperceptible. It was a scratching sound, distant but undeniable. It was like something small yet determined, trying to burrow its way through the wood. It wasn't the sound of insects or rodents. It was too deliberate, too intelligent. Ethan's blood ran cold. He pressed his ear to the floor, straining to hear more clearly. The scratching stopped, only to be replaced by something far worse, a low, wet gurgling sound. It echoed through the apartment, sending shivers crawling up his spine. He staggered backward, his heart thumping violently in his chest. He looked around the room again, his eyes frantic, desperate for an escape that seemed less and less likely with each passing second. The noise grew louder now. Whatever it was moving beneath the floor, closer to the surface. Ethan could feel it, a presence, pressing against the fragile boundary of the floorboards, as if waiting to break free. And then, without warning, the sound stopped. A tense, suffocating silence enveloped the room. Ethan stood motionless, holding his breath. The absence of sound was even more unsettling than the noises that had come before. He turned in a circle, trying to gather his thoughts, but his mind was a fog of confusion and fear. What the hell was happening? He glanced down at the floor again. The boards seemed to shimmer under the dim light, almost as if something was pushing against them from below, something powerful enough to warp the wood. Suddenly a loud crack split the silence, and one of the floorboards broke free, splintering into jagged pieces. Ethan jumped back in terror as something long and slender shot out from the gap, a twitching thin appendage that flailed in the air like a dying worm. It was slick, black, and covered in an oily, viscous substance. Ethan's stomach churned as the appendage slithered across the floor, writhing with a horrifying life of its own. A gurgling, rasping noise filled the room again, as though the thing was trying to speak. But its words were lost, distorted by the walls. Before Ethan could react, the thing pulled itself back into the gap beneath the floor, disappearing as quickly as it had emerged. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath shallow, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt weak, unsteady. His thoughts scrambled, but there was one thing that burned clear through the fog of fear. This wasn't just some freakish animal. This was something else, something that should not exist. His mind flashed back to the night before, to the low, insidious whispers that had plagued his thoughts, to the feeling of being watched, of being followed. The apartment wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Ethan stood there, his body trembling, staring at the broken floorboards. The space between the walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a dark, predatory presence that was aware of him, watching him closely. The walls weren't just closing in on him, they were alive, they were breathing. And they had no intention of letting him leave. He had to get out. He spun toward the door, but as his hand touched the handle, the light overhead flickered violently, casting long, twisting shadows that contorted around him like monstrous shapes. The shadows seemed to reach out, trying to wrap themselves around his body, pulling at him, dragging him back toward the center of the room. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard he pulled, it remained firmly locked, as if someone, was holding it shut from the other side. A whisper, a breath. Ethan. The voice, thick and slithering, came from the shadows. It echoed around the room, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. You should have left when you had the chance. His pulse raced. That voice, it was the same one from last night. He had heard it, buried deep in his mind, but it was real now. It was no longer just a figment of his imagination. It was here. It was in the room with him. He turned toward the corner, where the shadows seemed to move. It was there. The thing, whatever it was waiting for him. A dark shape slowly emerged from the corner of the room. Its eyes, glowing like molten fire, locked onto his, and he froze. The shape moved slowly, deliberately, as though it was savoring the fear that radiated from Ethan's every pore. It was no longer just a voice, no longer just a whisper. It was here, and it was hungry. Chapter 3. Beneath the surface. The air in Ethan's apartment seemed to thicken with every passing second. His chest was tight, his limbs heavy, like he was wading through a viscous fog. He could barely breathe as the shadows pressed in closer, their edges curling with malevolent intent, like they were alive, like they were aware. The thing in the corner, the thing with eyes like molten fire, hadn't moved. But Ethan could feel its presence, stretching and crawling, suffocating him from all sides. He stumbled backward, his feet tangling with the old floorboards as he struggled to maintain his balance. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but the door was still locked, its handle mocking him as he pulled and twisted, his heart pounding in his ears. His fingers slipped, slick with sweat, but the door wouldn't budge. The shadows, they were everywhere. The air seemed to grow colder, a frost creeping along the edges of the room, and with it came the feeling of being buried alive. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing for an explanation. But there was no explanation, no reason, no rational thought left to cling to. His thoughts were splintering, broken pieces scattered across the floor of his mind. The whispers from the dark thing, they were louder now. They weren't just sounds. They were like a presence, a weight on his chest, wrapping itself around his heart, tightening with every breath he took. Leave. Leave now before it's too late. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but the malice beneath it was undeniable. It crawled under his skin, making his blood run cold, as though the very air around him was alive, a predator waiting to strike. With a violent jerk, he wrenched himself away from the door and spun around, looking for any way out, any escape. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls warping, bending inward as if to crush him. His eyes darted to the window, but the blinds were drawn, the glass black and impenetrable. There was no way through there. The floorboards underfoot, shifted. Ethan froze, staring down at the surface beneath him as the wood groaned and twisted, bending in unnatural ways. Something was moving underneath it, the scratching, the scraping, the burrowing, like something small, something crawling, was pushing its way to the surface. It was faster now, frantic, its movement erratic as if driven by a primal need to escape, to find air. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, stumbling over his own feet as the floorboards before him cracked and splintered. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the wood parted, revealing a dark, yawning hole beneath it, a black void, too deep to fathom, a darkness that seemed to devour the light around it. A low, wet sound echoed from within the hole, like something heavy and slimy was writhing in the depths. It was the same sound he had heard before, the thing from beneath the floor, but now it was more pronounced, more insistent, as though it was calling to him, pulling at him. He stepped forward, hypnotized by the sound, drawn to it like a moth to flame. The shadows in the room moved with him, clinging to his limbs, wrapping around his body like tendrils. The hole, it beckoned. Ethan didn't know why, but he found himself crouching down, closer to the hole, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He could feel the darkness pulling at him, its grip tightening, threatening to drag him into the abyss. He had to stop. He had to pull away. He knew this wasn't real, couldn't be real. But something inside him, deep inside his chest, urged him to look closer. The whispers were louder now, closer, their voices a chorus of tortured souls reaching out for him, beckoning him into the void. "Look closer," they whispered. "Come closer. You need to see." A cold, clammy hand grasped at his shoulder, freezing him in place. The fingers were sharp, bony, and ice-cold, sending a shock of terror through his spine. His body stiffened, and he turned, half expecting to find someone standing behind him. But there was nothing, only darkness. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The eyes. The glowing, molten eyes. They weren't just in the corner anymore. They were all around him, watching, piercing through the darkness, their fiery gaze locked onto his with unrelenting force. And in that instant, he knew. It had been waiting for him. The thing, the creature beneath the floor, beneath the walls, beneath the very foundation of the apartment, had been waiting for him to slip, to falter, to allow himself to be consumed by its dark pull. He couldn't breathe. His chest was tight, constricted. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He was paralyzed, trapped in the relentless grip of the darkness. The floor beneath him gave another loud groan, and the hole widened, its jagged edges splitting open like the maw of some terrible beast. Something poured out from the depths, thick, black and tar-like, crawling, slithering its way toward him. The walls were breathing now. They moved in and out, the pulse of the house matching his own ragged breathing. The shadows, the thing in the corner, the cold hand still gripping his shoulder, all melded into one oppressive force. And then, the first tendril reached out, snaking up his leg with unholy speed. It was slick, slimy, and alive. It wrapped around his ankle, tightening, pulling him toward the hole, toward the darkness that seemed to stretch into infinity. A scream tore itself from his throat, but no sound came. His mouth moved, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the suffocating silence that now enveloped him. He could only feel the weight of the thing, dragging him deeper into the black void beneath the floor. He clawed at the air, his hands desperately reaching for anything solid, anything to hold on to. But the darkness, it was everywhere, and the thing beneath the floor was relentless. It would not let him go. The walls pulsed with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The shadows twisted, wrapping themselves tighter, pulling him in, deeper and deeper. And then, just as he thought he could not endure another second of the suffocating pressure, the world around him went silent. No whispers, no scraping, no gurgling, just the crushing weight of nothingness. Ethan felt himself falling into the dark. And then, nothing. Chapter 3. Continued. The unseen hand. The moment Ethan thought he was sinking into the abyss, the weight of the darkness seemed to release its grip, just enough to let him breathe. He gasped, his lungs burning with the strain of air that felt wrong. It was too thin, too cold. It didn't fill him with life. It was as if the air itself was suffused with the absence of something. The more he tried to inhale, the less it seemed to help, as if his body was being starved of sustenance. His mind was spinning, disoriented, struggling to find sense in a world that had utterly unraveled. But in the silence that followed, there was an unmistakable sense of being watched. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. Ethan's eyes snapped open. The darkness had not fully relented, but the oppressive weight on his chest had eased, as if the very air were holding its breath, waiting. His body, trembling, moved against the pull of the unseen hand still resting on his shoulder. It had not disappeared. He could feel the cold, clammy fingers still gripping him tightly. The temperature in the room had dropped to sub-zero levels, and the bone-deep chill gnawed at his spine like the sharp bite of winter. With a jolt, he sat up, looking wildly around. The apartment, the room, was different. The once familiar space, the clutter of books, the stained couch, the half-eaten pizza on the table, all of it felt alien now, distorted by the overwhelming presence of something. The shadows that once clung to the corners of the room seemed to have grown, stretching longer, darker, as if they were alive and growing. And that thing, The thing in the corner still lingered, its fiery molten eyes burning through the dark like twin suns, their gaze locking onto him with unbearable intensity. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. They moved slowly, stiffly, as if resisting his command. The pressure in the room was suffocating, closing in around him, forcing his every movement into slow motion. It felt as though the very walls were pushing in, the ceiling lowering ever so slightly, like a giant hand was ready to crush him. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the thing he couldn't understand, couldn't fight, the hole in the floor. He remembered that, the black void that stretched beneath the apartment like an endless tunnel to nowhere. It wasn't just a hole in the floor. It had been a portal, something that had opened up to show him the depths of the horror lurking beneath, something that had invited him in. I have to get out of here. The thought crashed through his mind, a sudden surge of clarity in the midst of his spiraling panic. But before he could move, he heard it again, the faint scraping sound. The subtle, almost inaudible scritch from beneath the floorboards. Ethan froze, his breath hitching. It was getting louder now, more urgent, the sound of something struggling to break free. The floorboards above the hole. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body remained rooted to the spot. It was as if the apartment had become a prison, its very air thick with dread. The thing beneath the floor was stirring, moving with purpose, its movement chaotic and unsettling. He could feel its presence, its insidious crawl inching closer, closer, like a monstrous insect preparing to pounce. No. Ethan stumbled backward, his eyes fixed on the center of the room where the hole in the floor was widening again, its jagged edges cracking and splitting, the edges darkened by an inky substance that oozed from the crevices. The thing was pushing its way up, breaking free from whatever had held it below the surface. Then, the silence shattered. A sickening, wet crack echoed through the room as something slithered up through the hole. It wasn't just a tendril now. It was a mass, a writhing, pulsating coil of black, tar-like substance, thick and organic, oozing up with a sickening squelch. It was like a part of the house itself, like the very foundation of the apartment had come alive and was now crawling out of its own wounds. Ethan wanted to scream, but his voice failed him, his throat tight with terror. He backed away toward the door, his legs shaking so violently he almost collapsed. The thing, whatever it was no longer a small, crawling creature. It was growing, stretching, swelling into something far larger, far more monstrous than he could have ever imagined. The air was thick with it now. A black mist seemed to swirl and pulse from the mass of ooze, filling the room with a stench that was indescribable. Rotten, like decay itself, had poured into the room, flooding it with an insidious presence. The floor beneath him creaked ominously as the mass grew, its tendrils expanding outward in search of something, someone. In the distance, from the far corner of the room, he heard the familiar whispers again. But this time, they weren't just whispers. They were voices, low, guttural and pleading, ethereal, like spirits trapped in an endless loop of torment. You should have listened. Ethan didn't understand. His mind couldn't process the words. The thing in the corner, the thing beneath the floor, it had never been a creature. It wasn't even a being. It was an echo of something ancient and wrong, something that should have never been allowed to cross over into the world of the living. But now it was here. Now it was awake. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest. His hands fumbled at the doorknob, trying desperately to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. Panic swept over him, leaving him breathless and cold. His thoughts scattered, fleeing in all directions. But there was only one thought that lingered at the forefront of his mind. He had to get out. The thing in the corner, the thing beneath the floor. He knew deep down that it was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to give in to the terror that gripped his heart. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, urging him to surrender, to stop fighting. The shadows twisted, their shapes shifting like writhing serpents, closing in around him. He could feel their cold touch on his skin, like icy fingers brushing against his body. The walls were no longer just walls. They were alive, and they were closing in on him. No, He slammed his palm against the door again, harder this time, and finally, with a horrible grating sound, the lock gave way. The door swung open. But what lay beyond the door was not the hallway he remembered. It was darkness. Endless, thick, impenetrable darkness. The void beyond the door seemed to stretch forever, pulling at his very soul. Ethan could feel it, like a black hole sucking him in, dragging him deeper into the abyss. His body refused to move forward, though his mind screamed at him to run, to flee. And then, from the corner of the room, he heard it again. "You should have listened." But this time, the voice wasn't just a whisper, it was a scream. Ethan didn't have time to think. He bolted. Chapter 4. The hunger beneath Ethan's legs was screaming, but he didn't stop running. His body moved on pure instinct, propelled by the fear that surged through him like electricity. The dark hallway stretched before him like an endless chasm, the darkness closing in from all sides, swallowing him whole. There was no escape, no way out. It was as if the very house was alive, feeding on his terror, drawing him further into its belly. His breath came in shallow, frantic gasps. His pulse roared in his ears, the rhythmic thump of his heart echoing like a drumbeat urging him forward. But with each step, the air grew heavier, thicker, as if something was weighing him down. His feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, the darkness gripping his ankles, pulling at him with unseen hands. He stumbled, but managed to catch himself against the wall. The cold of the plaster seeped into his skin, icy fingers crawling up his arm, biting into his flesh. The sensation was sickening, like something in the walls wanted to touch him, wanted to consume him. The apartment wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. The whispers were there again, but louder this time. No longer soft, they were raw and desperate, crawling into his mind like an infection, burrowing deep. They spoke to him in 1,000 voices, their words overlapping in a discordant, maddening symphony. "You should have listened. It's too late now. Run, Ethan, run." The voices were all around him, inside his head, beneath his feet, in the very walls themselves. He could feel them, like they were wrapping around him, squeezing the air from his lungs, suffocating him with their hunger. He knew that they were not just spirits, not just remnants of the dead. They were something far worse. Ethan gritted his teeth, pushing forward. He had to get out, had to escape. But every turn he made only seemed to bring him deeper into the house. The hallway twisted and bent, defying all logic, as if it were alive, shifting to keep him trapped. Every corner he turned seemed to lead to another shadowed doorway, each more menacing than the last. There were no windows, no escape. Then ahead of him, something moved in the dark. A figure. At first it was nothing more than a blur, a flicker at the edge of his vision. But then it grew clearer, sharper, the shape of a person, standing motionless in the hallway. But as Ethan drew closer, his heart pounding, he saw something that stopped him cold. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. The figure was pale, unnaturally so, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its limbs impossibly long. Its head was cocked at a strange angle, its neck craned unnaturally to one side, eyes wide and black as pitch. There were no pupils, no whites, just endless empty voids staring into him. The air around it seemed to pulse, the darkness swirling in violent waves. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His legs refused to move. The figure's mouth stretched open, impossibly wide, its lips peeling back to reveal a dark, gaping maw. Inside, there was nothing but blackness, nothing but an empty void that seemed to pull at him, like the depths of the ocean, threatening to swallow him whole. God, what is it? The thing in the hallway, whatever it was, began to twitch, jerking unnaturally as if struggling to move. Its arms extended, elongated, the fingers stretching toward him, claw-like and twisted. It began to shamble toward him, each movement jerky and wrong, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Ethan couldn't move. He couldn't look away. It was as if the thing was drawing him in, pulling him toward it with a magnetic force that he couldn't resist. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to obey. His feet felt glued to the floor, the weight of fear anchoring him in place. Then the thing spoke. Its voice was a rasping, guttural sound, low and otherworldly, like the groan of ancient stone or the creak of an old door. "It's your turn now, Ethan." The words crawled under his skin, curling around his spine like icy fingers. He tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't move. The thing's fingers were almost upon him now, inching closer, each twitch of its limbs sending a sickening ripple through the air. "You should have listened." And then it lunged. Ethan finally found his voice. He screamed. His legs obeyed, his body finally reacting to the primal urge to escape. He turned and bolted, his feet slipping on the polished wooden floor as he tore down the hallway, back toward the room he'd just fled from. But he couldn't look back. He couldn't risk it. He could hear the creature's footsteps behind him, its unnatural movements like the scraping of bone against stone, each step echoing in the darkness, getting closer, closer. His chest was burning with the effort to run, his lungs gasping for air, but no matter how fast he ran, the sound of its pursuit only grew louder, closer. It was as if the very house itself was shifting, moving, trapping him. The walls seemed to close in around him, narrowing the space, making him feel smaller, weaker. The air grew colder still, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones, slowing him down, weighing him down. He could feel it. It was just behind him. The presence, the thing that stalked him. Its breath, if it even had breath, was cold against his neck. Its fingertips brushed his skin, sending a shock of icy terror through him. Ethan turned a corner, and the darkness swallowed him whole. He stumbled into what felt like another room, but it was wrong, distorted, as if it were a twisted reflection of the one he had just fled from. The walls were crooked, the floor uneven, and the shadows. The shadows in this room moved, writhing, shifting like they were alive, stretching toward him, pulling him in. And there, standing in the center of the room, was the hole from before, the black void. But this time, it was wider, larger, its edges jagged and bleeding a dark, tar-like substance. The very air around it seemed to hum with a low, ominous energy, vibrating with some ancient power that Ethan could not comprehend. He knew what he had to do. There was no other choice. He had to jump. He had to escape. With his heart in his throat and his stomach churning with dread, Ethan took a deep breath, closing his eyes, and leaped into the abyss. Chapter 4. The Hunger Beneath continued. The air felt heavier as Ethan fell. His stomach lurched with each passing moment, the sensation of weightlessness disorienting him. It wasn't like a free fall. No. It was more like being pulled downward, into something deep and hollow, as though he were sinking into a pit of blackness that stretched on for eternity. The absence of light pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating, devouring him in its relentless, crushing grip. His mind screamed, his thoughts whirling in a dizzying spiral of confusion. Where was he? What was happening? The sound of his heartbeat was deafening in his ears, drowning out everything else. But then, he felt it. A tug. It wasn't physical, not exactly, but it was unmistakable. Something inside him, something primal, a part of him that he had long buried beneath the layers of rational thought, began to stir. It was hunger, not the kind of hunger that came from needing food, but something darker, something deeper. It was calling to him. The hunger gnawed at the very core of his being. He could feel it, crawling under his skin like a parasite, slithering through his veins. The void beneath him seemed to stretch wider, and the sensation of falling intensified, as if the darkness itself was hungry for his soul, pulling him into its grasp. His chest constricted with panic. He had to stop it. He had to fight it, but the pull was too strong. The hunger was too powerful. No, 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 no! The darkness wrapped around him like a cold, suffocating blanket. He gasped for air, but it was thick and foul, as though the very air had turned to tar. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the void, drowned in the crushing silence that pressed in on all sides. His limbs felt heavy, his movements sluggish, as if the darkness itself were trying to hold him in place. And then, suddenly, the fall stopped. It wasn't a gentle stop. It was like hitting a wall, an invisible barrier that jerked him to a halt mid-air, leaving his body suspended for a brief moment, weightless, before gravity reclaimed him with a sickening thud. His knees slammed into the cold, uneven surface beneath him, and the shock reverberated through his body. He groaned in pain, the world spinning around him. When he finally forced his eyes open, his surroundings became clear, or at least somewhat clearer. The darkness hadn't receded, but there was a faint, sickly glow ahead of him, casting grotesque shadows on the jagged, rough walls. He didn't know where he was. The ground beneath him was a mixture of dirt and something softer, almost gelatinous like rotting flesh. The air smelled foul, a mix of decay and something metallic that made his stomach twist in revolt. His hands trembled as he pushed himself up, every instinct in him telling him to run. But where? Where could he possibly run to when everything around him felt wrong? A low, rumbling sound echoed in the distance, the vibrations carrying through the ground like a growl from some monstrous creature. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The hunger in the air seemed to grow stronger, more insistent, as if the very ground beneath him was pulsing with it, feeding off the terror that coursed through his veins. Something was down here. He wasn't alone. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. The glow ahead of him grew brighter, casting long, grotesque shadows against the walls. It wasn't a light in the traditional sense, but rather a pulsing, sickly illumination that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, thrumming with an unnatural energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Don't look back," he told himself. But it was too late. Behind him, the shadows began to move. At first it was subtle, just a shifting in the corners of his vision, a flicker of movement that might have been the wind or his imagination. But as he turned to face the glowing light ahead, it grew clearer. The shadows were growing, stretching toward him, twisting into shapes that were no longer human. They were eyes in the walls, in the darkness, in the very air around him. Thousands of them, blinking, watching, waiting. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His entire body screamed at him to run. But the hunger was louder now, urging him to step forward, toward the glow, toward the thing at the center of it all. He took a step, then another, his feet moving on their own, compelled by forces beyond his understanding. His mind raced with questions. What was happening? Where was he? But every step he took felt like it was bringing him closer to an answer he didn't want to know. As he drew closer to the source of the glow, he saw it, a pit. A massive, gaping hole in the ground, surrounded by a mass of writhing, undulating shapes. The glow came from within it. Not light, but a sickly, organic luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the hole itself. It was as though the hole had been carved into the earth by something alive, something that fed on the very essence of whatever fell into its depths. And within the pit, something moved. A shape, an outline, something alive. Ethan's legs moved faster now, his body no longer in control. The hunger was unbearable, a gnawing, aching emptiness that could only be satisfied by that thing in the pit. He reached the edge and looked down. The creature was massive, impossibly so. Its body seemed to be made of shifting, amorphous shadows, like a mass of living darkness that rippled and pulsed with an energy he could feel deep in his bones. Its eyes were the same black voids he had seen before, but these were bigger, wider, hungry. Its mouth was a cavernous, yawning abyss, filled with jagged, broken teeth that seemed to writhe and squirm. It was feeding. And Ethan was next. He could feel its gaze on him, inside him, like it was crawling beneath his skin, burrowing into his thoughts. It was whispering to him, telling him things he didn't want to hear. "Come closer. Come feed me. It's what you want." A sickening pulse of need swelled in his chest. He knew what it wanted. It wanted him. He stepped forward, closer to the edge. His hands reached out, and the hunger within him clawed at his insides, urging him to surrender, to fall into the pit, to join the thing that waited, writhing in the darkness. And for a moment, he almost did. His fingers tingled as if they were being drawn to the pit, to the thing, to the terrible consuming hunger. But then, something deep within him, snapped. He recoiled, stepping back from the edge, his heart pounding in his chest, the hunger inside him roaring in protest. He had been so close to losing himself to it, but he wasn't ready to let go, not yet. With one final, desperate movement, Ethan turned on his heel and fled. Chapter 5. The Crawling Silence. Ethan stumbled through the inky blackness, his heart thudding against his ribs like a drumbeat that never stopped. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion, panic, and a lingering hunger that gnawed at his insides, tugging at him from within. It wasn't the hunger of an empty stomach. No. This was a deeper hunger, something darker and more insidious, a craving that could never be sated, no matter how far he ran. The glow behind him dimmed as he moved away, but the pulse of the void seemed to follow, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet, an echo of the hunger that now seemed to permeate the very air. The walls of the cavern, if that's what this place even was, pressed in on him, narrowing with each step. The sense of claustrophobia was overwhelming, like the space itself was alive, breathing, and watching him. His mind was a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts. Where am I? What is this place? He had no answers, only more questions. His legs burned with the effort of running, but his body moved on, driven by sheer instinct. Something deep inside told him that stopping, pausing for even a moment, would mean an end, a final surrender to the darkness that had already claimed so much of him. The walls around him seemed to shift and change as he moved. Jagged edges rose up like the teeth of some monstrous creature, sharp and unforgiving. The passage twisted in ways that defied logic, the labyrinth of corridors stretching endlessly, twisting back on itself. It felt like he was going in circles. And yet, no matter which direction he turned, there was nothing but darkness, and the growing sense that something was following him. He could feel it, could hear it, just at the edges of his consciousness, the faintest skittering sound, like something dragging its body across the floor, just out of sight. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by fear. But then the sound came again, closer this time, sharp and skittering, like nails scraping against stone. His pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. Ethan whipped around, but the passageway behind him was empty. Empty but for the ever-encroaching darkness. He tried to control his breathing, to steady his panicked mind, but the hunger inside him, the pull, it was getting worse. His limbs felt heavier, his vision blurred at the edges. He needed to keep moving. He needed to get out of here. And then he saw it, a flicker of movement just at the corner of his eye, something small darting across the ground. The sound of it was soft at first, like the tapping of fingernails, and then the unmistakable sound of legs, too many legs, scraping against stone. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat. His body didn't want to move. He didn't want to look. But he couldn't help it. His eyes turned, drawn toward the movement as though some unseen force was pulling his gaze. And there, in the dim light of the cavern, he saw it. A creature. It was small, almost tiny, but that didn't make it any less horrifying. Its body was like a mass of writhing, slick black legs, all moving in perfect synchronization, skittering and twisting with unnatural speed. Its head, if you could call it a head, was a bulbous mass of twitching eyes, all staring at him with an insatiable predatory hunger. It clicked its mandibles, the sound sharp and fast, like the clicking of teeth, and Ethan's blood ran cold. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but his feet were frozen to the spot, his body paralyzed by terror. And then, without warning, it lunged. It was fast, faster than anything should have been, and in an instant, it was on him. The creature's legs scraped against his skin, sharp and cold like steel, its weight pressing down on him, forcing him to the ground. He could feel its body, slick and trembling, squirming over him, its countless legs burrowing into his flesh as if trying to crawl inside him. The hunger, that insidious, gnawing hunger, flared up inside him again, stronger than before, like a fire racing through his veins. His mind screamed in revolt, but his body wanted it, wanted the creature, wanted the darkness, wanted whatever it was that lurked inside this hellish place. No, he pushed back, summoning every ounce of strength left in his exhausted body. He could not give in, not to this. He clawed at the creature, swatting at it with trembling hands, but it was relentless, its tiny, wriggling body covering him like a suffocating living blanket. It screeched, an unnerving, high-pitched sound, and dug deeper into his skin. But then, there was a flash of light, a spark of something bright, cutting through the overwhelming darkness. The creature froze. For a moment, everything went still. The clicking stopped. The hunger paused, as if the very air had held its breath. Ethan gasped, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. He had no idea what had happened, but in that brief moment of stillness, something inside him snapped. With a primal scream, he threw the creature off, pushing it away with all his remaining strength. The thing flew backward, its body flailing helplessly before it vanished into the shadows. Ethan didn't wait to see where it had gone. He stumbled to his feet, his mind racing, adrenaline flooding his body. He had to keep moving. He had to get out of this place before the hunger consumed him, before whatever that thing had been could drag him back into the pit. His legs burned as he sprinted through the winding passageways, his every step feeling like it could be his last. The darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides, like an invisible wall closing in around him. But he kept running. The air was thick and foul, and his chest ached with every breath he took, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. And then, up ahead, just as he was sure he would collapse, he saw it. A door. It was a small, weathered door, almost indistinguishable from the walls around it. But there was no mistaking the faint glow seeping from the cracks along the edges. It wasn't much, a dull, sickly yellow light. But it was enough. Enough to give him hope. Enough to make him believe that there was a way out. He reached it with trembling hands, pushing on the rusted handle with all the force he could muster. The door creaked open, a shrill, tortured sound that echoed through the cavern, and Ethan stumbled through. On the other side, he collapsed. And the moment he crossed the threshold, everything stopped. The hunger, the creature, the darkness, it was gone. But as Ethan lay there, gasping for breath on the cold floor of the new room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Something that was still waiting for him just beyond the door. He wasn't safe. Not yet. Chapter 6. The Watchers Behind the Walls. The door slammed shut behind Ethan with a thud that vibrated through his very bones. The quiet that followed was almost suffocating. The silence was so complete, it felt as though the world had paused, holding its breath. He didn't know what was worse, the silence or the weight of what had been left behind in the darkness. He lay on the cold stone floor, his chest heaving with the effort of sucking in air. His hands were trembling, slick with sweat, and his heart pounded like a drum in his ears. The hunger had not disappeared. It was still there, crawling beneath his skin, an insidious presence that gnawed at his insides. The need to feed, whatever that meant, was so overwhelming that it made his stomach lurch. But there was something else, something that made him feel smaller, weaker, a sense of dread that twisted its way around his throat like a tightening noose. He didn't know where he was, but it didn't matter. He'd crossed through the door, and now he was trapped in whatever this place was. The room he had entered was small, damp, and oppressive. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot, as though the very walls had absorbed years of decay. The faint, sickly glow that had lit the door faded as his eyes adjusted to the dim surroundings. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as though reaching for him, beckoning him to remain. Slowly, he pushed himself upright, his legs weak beneath him. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. The creature, the thing with too many legs, was gone. But the sensation of it crawling across his skin was still fresh. His body was covered in a cold sweat, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the creature's dark, bulbous eyes staring at him, its body writhing like a mass of serpents. He couldn't let himself think about it. Not now. Ethan's gaze swept across the room, looking for something, anything, that might explain where he had ended up. The walls were featureless, made of rough-hewn stone that looked as though it had been carved by hands long since turned to dust. There was no door on the other side, no visible exit, just the oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. His mind screamed for him to move, to find a way out, but his body was sluggish, drained. A low creak echoed from the far corner of the room. Ethan froze. His pulse quickened, and he strained to listen, trying to detect where the sound had come from. It had been faint, barely perceptible, but it was there, unmistakable. Something was in the room with him. He wasn't alone. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He could see his breath now, a thin mist that curled and dissipated into the dark. The cold was unnatural, biting into his skin, as though the very air around him was laced with something malevolent. He turned slowly, his heart in his throat, every sense on high alert. The room was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to writhe and shift in the corners. The walls closed in on him, their cold, oppressive surfaces pressing against him. He could feel their weight, as though they were watching him, waiting for something. "It's in here with me," he thought. "Something is watching me from the walls." His mind raced, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. Was it the creature? Had it followed him through the door, or was there something else in this place? Something older, more ancient. The creaking came again, louder this time, like the sound of wood straining under an unseen weight. Ethan whipped around, his eyes scanning the room, but saw nothing. He could hear the rustling now, like something dragging itself across the stone floor, something that was moving just out of sight. He felt a cold draft on the back of his neck, and instinctively, his hand shot up, fingers brushing the nape of his neck. His skin prickled, as though the air itself was alive, crawling across his flesh. He had to get out. There had to be an exit somewhere. Ethan stumbled toward the far wall, his legs weak beneath him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of a way out. But there was nothing. No doors, no windows, no openings. And then, in the corner of his vision, he saw it. A shadow. It was tall and thin, its form almost indistinct in the dim light, like a wraith made of the darkness itself. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, its shape flickering and distorting like smoke. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and the blood in his veins turned to ice. He couldn't move. His body was frozen, caught in the grip of pure terror. The shadow seemed to grow, stretching and twisting as though it were reaching for him, its dark tendrils creeping along the walls, inching closer with every passing second. And then it spoke. The voice was a whisper, a soft hiss that slid through the air like a snake's tongue. "You shouldn't have come here, Ethan." The words were not spoken aloud. They were inside his head, as if the shadow were inside his very mind, whispering directly to his soul. The voice was familiar, too familiar, something he had heard before. But where? "You can't escape it." The shadow stretched further, and Ethan's body trembled. He took a step backward, but his legs gave out beneath him, sending him sprawling to the cold floor. The darkness seemed to rush toward him, its edges closing in, suffocating, consuming. He could feel the air around him growing thick with the scent of decay, of death, of things long forgotten. "You are mine now," the voice whispered again, this time with a sense of finality, a certainty that sent a cold wave of despair washing over him. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His mouth was dry, his throat tight, as though the very air had been stolen from his lungs. His eyes were wide with terror, his mind racing, but nothing made sense anymore. What was happening to him? What was this place? Who or what was that thing? The shadow advanced, its tendrils reaching out like grasping fingers, the air growing colder with each passing second. And then, just as it seemed the darkness would engulf him entirely, there was a sound, faint at first, but growing louder, more distinct. A door. It was opening. Ethan's heart leapt in his chest, and with every ounce of strength he could muster, he scrambled toward the sound. The shadow reached for him, its cold fingers grazing the back of his neck, sending a jolt of ice through his body. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He threw himself toward the door, his hand grasping the cold, rusted handle, and yanked it open with all his might. Light spilled into the room, bright and blinding, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness that had surrounded him. Ethan stumbled through the door, into the light, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing. And as he stepped through, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The silence that followed was deafening. Chapter 6. Continued. The Watchers behind the walls. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as he stepped through the door, the blinding light washing over him like a cleansing flood. It was the first time he had felt something remotely resembling safety in what seemed like an eternity. For a moment, he thought he might collapse from sheer exhaustion, but the cold grip of fear still lingered in his bones, tightening, pressing down on his chest, unwilling to let him rest. The door slammed shut behind him, its groan echoing through the room, an eerie reminder of what had just passed. He didn't dare to turn around. The darkness he had just fled from felt tangible now, as though it could reach out and drag him back with invisible hands. But there was no time to waste. He had to keep moving. His legs were unsteady, and the air in the new room he had entered was thick, too thick, almost suffocating. It was colder here, colder than it had been before. The smell of mildew and decay mingled with something darker, something old. The walls, too, were made of rough stone, but these felt different, as if they were alive. They seemed to pulse, like the beating of some ancient heart. The floors beneath his feet were covered in dust, layers of it, as though no one had stepped here in centuries. He wiped a hand across his forehead, the sweat still slick on his skin. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Ethan closed his eyes, steadying himself, trying to gather his thoughts. His mind was racing, the adrenaline still pumping through him. He needed a plan, something to help him escape this place. But nothing came. The thoughts were jumbled, and his memory felt fractured, pieces of it slipping away, fading into the shadows. "Get it together," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. He had to focus. He couldn't let the fear take control again. He had come this far, hadn't he? He pushed forward, moving toward the far corner of the room. There, he saw it. A set of heavy wooden double doors, old and weathered, their edges chipped and worn as though they had been opened and closed thousands of times. The dark wood gleamed in the low light, but it seemed to draw the very darkness toward it, as if the door itself were feeding on the shadows around it. Ethan's hand shook as he reached out to touch the handle. It was cold, colder than anything he'd ever felt before, a chill that went deep, sinking into his bones. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing down the narrow corridor on the other side. A long, dark hallway stretched before him, the faintest glimmer of light at its end. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't. Not now. He had come this far, and whatever lay ahead had to be better than what he had just escaped. He stepped into the hallway, and the door behind him slammed shut with a force that rattled his teeth. He jumped, his heart racing in his chest, but the silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of silence that made everything feel wrong. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls narrowing as he walked deeper into its maw. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something ancient and terrible. There were no windows, no escape. The light at the end of the hallway was distant, almost unreachable, as if it were deliberately out of his grasp. The floor beneath him creaked with every step, but that was nothing compared to the sound that suddenly filled the air, low, steady, almost imperceptible, like a whisper too soft to catch. Ethan paused, his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. The noise wasn't a voice, it was more like a scraping, like something moving just beneath the surface of reality itself. He pushed forward, his feet dragging, the air growing thicker with every step. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, as though something was inching toward him from the walls themselves. Ethan glanced around, his senses on high alert, his hands trembling at his sides. Suddenly, the faintest sound of laughter echoed down the hall. It was soft at first, a breathy, almost mocking chuckle that seemed to come from nowhere. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and every muscle in his body screamed for him to turn around and run, but there was nowhere to run. "Stay calm," he told himself. "It's just in your head." But the laughter came again, clearer this time. A haunting sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It wasn't just a laugh. It was a voice, soft and insidious, whispering directly into his ear. "You can't run, Ethan. You can't hide." His skin crawled at the words, the voice dripping with malice. The hallway seemed to stretch out farther in front of him, an endless void of darkness and decay. His breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears, and every nerve in his body was on fire. He needed to get out. He had to. The floor beneath him suddenly shifted, the stone giving way with a loud groan. Ethan stumbled, his heart jumping into his throat as he tried to steady himself. The laughter intensified, echoing in his ears, deafening. The walls seemed to close in, the space around him warping and twisting, as if reality itself were unraveling. Before he could react, the scraping noise returned, louder, sharper this time, and something rushed toward him from the shadows. Something large, something fast. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs as he turned to run, but his legs were weak, uncooperative. The floor seemed to buckle beneath him, each step taking him further away from the light at the end of the hallway. He couldn't breathe. The walls were pressing in from all sides, closing in like a trap. The laughter, that terrible, mocking laughter, filled his ears, drowning out everything else. It was everywhere now, surrounding him, suffocating him. And then, just as the scraping sound grew deafening, he saw it. Something at the very end of the hall. Something dark and shrouded in shadow, watching him with glowing eyes. He couldn't make out the form. Only the eyes. Two bright, malevolent orbs staring at him, unblinking, unmoving. He was trapped. There was no escape. Chapter 7. Echoes of the forgotten. Ethan's breathing was shallow as he stumbled back, his body pressed against the cold, jagged stone of the wall. The figure in front of him was something he couldn't quite comprehend. Its shape was shifting, elusive, and yet it was undeniably there. The eyes, those malevolent orbs, fixed on him with a hunger that made his stomach churn. He could feel the weight of its gaze, like an iron hand pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. The silence between them was unbearable, stretching out like an eternity. The darkness surrounding them seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though the very walls of the hall were alive, watching, breathing. Ethan's mind raced, every thought jumbled and fractured. He could no longer tell if he was awake or lost in some waking nightmare. Every sense was overwhelmed. He could smell the mildew, the rot, the weight of ages upon him. The air was thick with the scent of something decaying, something ancient, something that had waited far too long for its chance to awaken. The thing before him, whatever it was, shifted again, moving slowly toward him. The laughter he had heard earlier grew louder, no longer distant, but now right beside him, in his ears, in his mind. He felt its presence, the hunger it harbored. The laughter twisted, contorted, until it sounded like a distorted wail. A scream trapped within layers of mocking whispers. "You think you can escape?" the voice rasped, its words curling around his mind like fingers made of smoke, slippery and cold. "You think you can outrun what's already inside you?" Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as he struggled to tear himself away from the wall. His legs felt like they were made of lead, his feet dragging along the floor, uncooperative, as though the very stone beneath him was trying to keep him there. Keep him in place. His head swam, dizziness washing over him as the creature's laughter filled his skull. Every inch of him screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls around him seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, distorting, pulling at his senses. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The eyes before him burned with an intensity that pierced through his very soul. They were not human eyes, not animal eyes. They were ancient eyes, eyes that had seen the death of worlds and the end of time. "You're already here, Ethan." The voice was softer now, almost a whisper, but the weight of it pressed down on him like a vice. "You're part of this place now. You always have been." The words sank into him, deep, deeper than he wanted to acknowledge. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but his throat felt thick, constricted. The world around him blurred, the edges of reality bending, warping, as though the very fabric of his existence was unraveling. Then, the eyes blinked. The sound of the blink was an echo, sharp and cold, like a door slamming shut. And then, for the briefest moment, the room was still. The shifting shadows paused, and the laughter stopped. Ethan didn't know what it meant, but something had changed. Something was different now. The thing in front of him was still there, but it was no longer advancing. Instead, it stood still, watching him, waiting. It was as if it were considering him, like some ancient being toying with its prey, savoring the moment before striking. The silence hung heavy in the air, but even that felt wrong. It was unnatural, as if the very concept of sound had been twisted into something grotesque. Ethan tried to force his limbs to move, to run, but his body refused. It was as if the ground had grown roots beneath his feet, holding him fast. His muscles screamed in protest, but they refused to obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in place, caught between the darkness and the abyss that stared back at him with burning eyes. "You've been chosen," the voice said again. And this time, it wasn't just in his ears. It was inside his mind, echoing through every thought, every memory, every fleeting moment of his life. Chosen to witness the end. Chosen to remember what's forgotten. He felt something stir deep within him. Something he couldn't name. Something that didn't belong. It was as though his very soul was being pulled, ripped, torn from his body. The walls seemed to lean closer, their presence suffocating. He could hear the slow, methodical pulse of the heart. Was it his own? No. It was something older, something darker, something that had been waiting, watching, in the silence. The creature's eyes narrowed. For the first time since it had appeared, it seemed to smile. The smile was twisted, a grotesque thing that split its face open in unnatural ways. Its teeth, if they could be called teeth, were jagged and malformed, growing like thorns from a twisted vine, long and sharp. It didn't move, not physically, but its presence, its being, was closing in around him, suffocating him. And then, something in his mind snapped. A memory, a fragment of something forgotten, something buried deep beneath the terror. He remembered something. A name, Sophia. The name echoed through his mind, a beacon in the darkness. He didn't understand why it mattered, but it did. She had been here. She had been in this place, had seen these things. She had known the truth. She had... "You know her," the voice interrupted, the words filling his mind with a sharp, burning sensation. "She was here, just like you. She saw what lies beneath, and now you will see it too." The room around him seemed to shift again, the shadows taking on a more solid form. It was like the walls were alive, breathing, moving in time with the unnatural pulse of the heart. And then suddenly, the floor cracked beneath him, splitting wide open. A scream, raw and guttural, tore from his throat as he fell. There was no ground below him, no floor to catch him. He was falling, tumbling through an abyss that seemed endless. The walls of the hallway, the doors, the eyes, they all faded, melting into darkness as he descended, deeper, into the cold heart of the earth. His mind raced as he fell. He tried to scream again, but the air was thick, heavy, and he couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could feel was the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides, crushing him, suffocating him. And then, as the blackness enveloped him completely, he heard it. The whisper, soft as a breeze, but clear as a bell. "You can never leave." Chapter 8. The silence of the forgotten. Ethan's vision swam in a murky sea of darkness. He could feel the weight of the abyss pressing down on him, suffocating every thought, every breath, as if the very air had turned to stone. His body felt like it had been stretched thin, pulled apart at the seams, and yet he couldn't escape. He was falling, endlessly, his body weightless, but the sensation of descent clung to him like an oppressive fog. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost. His mouth felt dry, the words suffocated before they could leave his throat. He was drowning in the silence, but the silence wasn't empty. No, the silence was full of something, something waiting. The fall seemed to last for an eternity. His mind couldn't grasp the passage of time. Was it seconds, minutes, hours? There was no way to tell. All he knew was that the darkness around him had become thick, almost viscous, like the very fabric of reality had been warped and turned into something liquid. Then, without warning, the descent stopped. His feet hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact jarring through his spine. He gasped, the air sharp in his lungs as he tried to steady himself, to push himself up from the cold, damp floor. His hands scraped against the rough surface, and for the first time he could feel something beneath him. Something real. Something solid. He opened his eyes, but the darkness hadn't lifted. It was still there, clinging to him like a shroud, wrapping around his body, choking him. But there was something else. The air, stale and suffocating, was thick with the scent of rot. Something old, something dead. His heart raced as he slowly stood, feeling the ground beneath him shift with every movement, as though the very earth was alive and breathing. His senses were overwhelmed by the smell, the dampness, the sound of his own breathing, the rapid heartbeat that seemed to echo in the silence. Then slowly, something else came into focus. A shape. No, not just a shape, a figure. It was standing at the far end of the room. He couldn't see it clearly, but he could feel its presence, its weight in the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its outline seemed to shimmer, as though it were made of the very shadows themselves, bending and flickering in the dim light. Ethan's blood ran cold. He tried to move, to back away, but his body refused to cooperate. His legs were like jelly, too weak to hold him upright. His arms trembled at his sides, useless, the muscles refusing to obey his commands. The figure shifted, a slight movement that was enough to make Ethan's pulse spike. It wasn't just standing there anymore, it was coming closer. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble with every step it took, and the temperature in the room plummeted, a chill so deep that it seemed to freeze the very marrow in his bones. His breath came in jagged gasps, his chest tightening as the air grew heavier, thick with an oppressive weight that seemed to press in from all sides. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate. It didn't seem to care about the distance between them, as though it had all the time in the world. The shadows around it seemed to shift with it, writhing and twisting like dark serpents, eager to wrap themselves around him, to pull him into the depths. And then the voice came. It was a whisper at first, so soft that it was almost imperceptible, like a breath against the back of his neck. But then it grew louder, clearer, until it was a low, guttural murmur that seemed to fill the entire room. You shouldn't have come here. The words slid into his mind like poison, creeping and insidious. Ethan tried to turn away, to run, but his legs betrayed him. He stumbled forward, his feet caught in some unseen snare, and he fell to the floor with a crash. The figure was standing above him now, its presence suffocating. It was so close that Ethan could feel the icy cold radiating from it, a cold that seemed to sink into his skin, into his very soul. The eyes, they were there. They had been there all along, hidden in the darkness, and now they were staring directly at him. The eyes of the thing, those empty soulless orbs that seemed to stare into the very depths of his being. They were alive, but not in any way that he could understand. They were ancient, timeless, eyes that had seen the rise and fall of worlds, eyes that held the secrets of the universe, and they were staring at him with an emptiness so deep that it threatened to consume him whole. Do you remember? The voice crooned. It was not just a voice now, it was a presence, a thing that had wormed its way into his mind, pulling at the threads of his memories, of his sanity. Do you remember what you were meant to do? Ethan's head spun. He felt the pull, the magnetism of the creature's gaze. It was as though every thought, every memory, was being yanked from his mind and replaced with a new understanding. The walls of his consciousness were crumbling, and something else, something ancient, was pushing its way into his mind. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block it out, but it was too late. The darkness was inside him now. He could feel it, curling around his thoughts, binding them together with invisible threads. Sophia, the voice hissed. You remember her now, don't you? You remember what she did, and what you are about to do. The floor beneath him seemed to shift again, and Ethan's heart slammed in his chest as a wave of nausea swept over him. He felt sick, his body racked with uncontrollable shudders as his mind spun out of control. No, it couldn't be true. It couldn't be. But the voice was relentless. It's all been planned, Ethan. From the beginning. He clutched his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his skull, desperate to hold on to whatever shred of himself still remained. The air was thick with the whispers now, the voices growing louder, their words twisted, incomprehensible. The darkness around him seemed to grow, expanding outward, swallowing everything in its path. He was trapped. He was lost. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The silence in the room was deafening. Ethan slowly opened his eyes and the figure was gone. The oppressive weight that had held him captive had vanished, and the darkness was empty. The ground beneath him had stopped shaking. The air was no longer suffocating. It was as if the world itself had reset, as if everything had been erased, leaving only the void behind. But he knew, deep down, that the silence was only temporary, that the darkness was waiting, lurking, patient, and that when it came again, he would be ready. Chapter 8. The Silence of the Forgotten continued. Ethan remained on the cold, damp floor for what felt like an eternity. His breaths were shallow, his heart beating erratically in his chest. His eyes darted around the empty room, but it was still just darkness, nothing but shadows clinging to the corners, the scent of decay thick in the air. There was no figure, no movement, but something insidious lingered. It was like the room itself had become a part of him, a malignant presence that watched from the walls, from the space between each breath. The silence was oppressive, almost alive, as if it could suffocate him with its very stillness. Ethan sat up slowly, his body trembling from both fear and exhaustion. His thoughts, disjointed and fragmented, raced through his mind like a swarm of insects, each one sharper than the last. He remembered the eyes, the darkness behind them, the whispering voice. "Sophia," the voice had said. "You remember her now, don't you?" He didn't know how, but he did remember her. He remembered her laughter, the way her hair cascaded over her shoulders like a dark waterfall. Her voice, soft and melodic, echoed in his mind. But it wasn't the Sophia he had known, the girl from his past. No, this was someone different. Someone changed, and he remembered his part in it. How could he have forgotten? The moment he had touched the earwig, he could still feel its presence inside his mind, burrowing deeper with every passing moment. Its whispers had invaded his thoughts, making him question everything: who he was, what he had done, what he still had to do. His stomach churned as the realization hit him. Sophia wasn't just a person. She was the key, the one who had unlocked this nightmare. Ethan staggered to his feet, his body weak from the strain. But there was a force now, pulling him forward. It wasn't just the call of the darkness, it was something else, something compelling him to move. He had to find Sophia. He had to understand what had happened to her, to them. He moved cautiously through the space, each step heavy, as if the floor itself resisted his presence. His fingers brushed against the walls, feeling their rough texture, the way they seemed to pulse beneath his touch. The shadows were deeper now, darker than before. It was as if the very air around him was growing thicker, more oppressive. The silence wasn't just deafening anymore. It was deceptive. Then he heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragging against the ground. It came from somewhere behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of shadow. He took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound came again, this time louder, and then closer. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the noise seemed to surround him, filling the room. His pulse quickened, a primal fear rising in his chest, making his throat tighten. It was as if the walls were closing in, pushing him toward the sound, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn back. The scraping was almost frantic now, like something desperate, something trying to break free. Without thinking, he rushed toward the source of the sound, his mind barely registering the danger, the raw terror that gripped him. The shadows seemed to twist around him, pulling at his legs, as if they were trying to drag him back into the darkness. Finally, he reached the far corner of the room. His eyes scanned the space, but it was empty, just a pile of rubble, old stone and dust. Yet there was something here. He could feel it, A faint glimmer caught his eye, a sliver of light, almost imperceptible, shining through the cracks in the wall. The scraping sound was louder now, more urgent, almost alive. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for the wall, his fingers sliding over the rough surface, searching for the source of the light. Then he found it. A crack, thin but unmistakable. He pried at it with all his strength, the stone crumbling beneath his fingertips, the darkness seeming to push back against him, resisting his every move. But the crack grew wider, just enough to reveal what lay beyond. There, behind the wall, was a hidden passage. Narrow and long, it disappeared into the blackness. The scraping had stopped, but the silence was worse now. It was as if something was waiting, watching from the depths of the passage. Ethan hesitated, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. He didn't know what he would find on the other side, but there was no turning back. He had no choice. He had to know. He had to find Sophia. With a deep breath, he stepped into the passage. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed to cling to him, wrapping around his body like a cold, damp shroud. His footsteps echoed in the narrow space, louder than they should have been, as though the walls themselves were listening, waiting. The further he walked, the darker it became. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. There was no sense of direction, no landmarks to guide him, just endless walls, suffocating darkness, and the oppressive silence. It felt like he was walking deeper into something, into the very heart of the thing that had been haunting him. The entity, the voice, the whispering that had never stopped. He could still hear it, deep in his mind, its low murmurings filling the empty space. But something was different now. The whispers weren't just coming from inside his head. They were coming from the walls, from the very air around him. "You shouldn't have come, Ethan." The voice was softer now, more intimate, like a lover's whisper, but the malice behind it was unmistakable. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he spun around, but there was nothing there, just the endless passage stretching before him. "You can't escape." His body trembled as he took another step, his footfall echoing through the passage like a gunshot in the dead of night. Each sound seemed amplified in this unnatural space, a dissonant noise that made his skin crawl. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was different. The air grew colder, heavier. The walls around him began to close in, slowly, relentlessly, pushing inward like the fingers of some unseen hand. The passage had become a trap, a narrowing coffin that was squeezing the very life out of him. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled forward, his legs shaking, his mind screaming for him to turn back. But it was too late. The darkness had him now. And then he saw it. At the end of the passage was a door. No, not a door, a gateway. It shimmered, faintly glowing with an unnatural light, as if it existed outside the rules of space and time. The edges of the doorway flickered like a flame, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Ethan's feet moved toward it of their own accord, his body no longer under his control. He reached the gateway, his hand hovering over the surface, a deep, insidious compulsion to step through it pulling him forward. As he touched the cold surface, a jolt of electricity ran through him, and the world around him seemed to fracture. The darkness folded inward, the walls collapsing into themselves, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Ethan could see it. The truth. Sophia's face twisted and contorted in agony, her eyes wide with terror as the shadows consumed her. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but there was no sound, and then the world collapsed into darkness once more. Chapter 9. The Echoes of Eternity. When Ethan opened his eyes again, the world had changed. It wasn't just the oppressive darkness or the suffocating cold. It was the stillness. A dead quiet that crawled beneath his skin, gnawing at his nerves, making him feel like a corpse stuck between two worlds. His body was no longer his own. The air was heavier now, thick with an unspoken presence. It wrapped around him like a shroud, suffocating, pressing down on his chest as though the weight of all the forgotten horrors of the world had collapsed upon him. He was standing now. How had he gotten here? The passageway, the gateway, had he passed through it? The questions swarmed in his mind, but the answers were elusive. just out of reach, like whispers in a dream. The world around him was no longer the crumbling, decayed space he'd just escaped. This place was different. This was something else. The ground beneath his feet felt solid yet uneven, as though it had once been smooth but had been worn away by time, or something else. His fingers brushed over the surface of what looked like stone, cold and smooth as marble. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there, lost in the void, but the longer he stood still, the more the silence seemed to press on him. It was all-consuming, suffocating. "Where am I?" The question slipped out of him before he could stop it, his voice hoarse and foreign, like he hadn't spoken in years, but there was no answer, only that silence again. The walls, if they were walls at all, seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction, creating an impossibly vast, empty space that made his mind spin in a circle. He moved forward, though he wasn't sure what direction he was going. It didn't seem to matter. His legs carried him despite the confusion, the overwhelming sense of wrongness that seeped into every part of his being. The stone floor was worn, cracked, with streaks of dark, oily liquid that seemed to seep from the cracks and swirl beneath his feet like something alive. The air tasted bitter, like rust, the smell of something long forgotten and decayed. Suddenly, a flicker of light caught his eye. Far ahead, a small, dim glow broke through the encroaching darkness. It was so faint, so tenuous, that for a moment Ethan thought it was an illusion. But no, it was real. There was light, a beacon, or perhaps a trap. Compelled by something deeper than instinct, Ethan moved toward the light, every step heavy, as if the air itself was trying to drag him back into the abyss. The dark seemed to retreat as he approached the light, but it was like a living thing, pulling back only to gather its strength to strike again. As he moved forward, the shadows seemed to curl in on themselves, their presence palpable, as if they were breathing, watching, waiting for something to happen. And then, as he drew closer, the light began to flicker. It wasn't natural light. There was no warmth to it, no sense of life. Instead, it pulsed, like the dying embers of a fire, struggling to stay alive in a storm. Ethan reached the source of the light, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a mirror. A tall, ornate mirror, framed in blackened wood that seemed to writhe and twist under his gaze. The reflection within the glass was distorted, shifting in ways that made him dizzy. His own face stared back at him, but it wasn't his face, not exactly. The eyes were hollow, like dark, endless pits. His features seemed sharper, more gaunt, and his skin had taken on a sickly pallor, as if all life had been drained from him. His heart thundered in his chest. He reached out a hand toward the mirror, half expecting the glass to be cold to the touch, but it was warm, as though it had been waiting for him. As soon as his fingers brushed the surface, the reflection of his face smiled. A grotesque, twisted smile stretched impossibly wide, and his heart stopped. The face in the mirror was not his own. It was a different version of him, older, weathered, broken, with hollow eyes that burned with an empty fire. The reflection lifted a hand and pressed it against the mirror, its fingers curling against the glass as though trying to escape. Ethan stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. His heart raced, and his hands trembled, sweat running down his face. The reflection did not move, at least not in the way it should have. It remained motionless, its eyes locked onto Ethan's, but Ethan could feel it. It was watching him, waiting. For a moment, there was nothing but that horrible, suffocating silence. Then, a low, guttural voice, his voice, but distorted, whispered from the reflection. "You've always known, Ethan. You've always known who you are." The words slithered into his mind like a cold snake, wrapping around his thoughts, squeezing until he could barely breathe. "Who are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice trembling. The reflection's smile widened, impossibly wide, stretching to the point where it seemed the face might break in half. "I am you," it whispered, its voice like the wind scraping against old bones. "And you are me. We are the same." Ethan recoiled, his pulse thudding in his ears as he stumbled backward, shaking his head violently. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. He wasn't standing here in front of this twisted version of himself. This was just another trick, another nightmare, but the reflection didn't disappear. It was still there, alive in the glass, its eyes dark pools of despair and rage, its smile slowly turning into something more sinister, more predatory. The air around Ethan grew colder, and he could feel the shadows closing in again. He backed away from the mirror, but the moment he turned, he felt something cold and heavy brush against the back of his neck. He whipped around, but there was nothing there. The mirror was still there, watching him. But now there was something else. A shadow, a figure just outside the range of the mirror's light, a shape that seemed to grow from the darkness, slipping through the edges of his perception. It was a woman. At least it looked like a woman. Tall, slender, her form draped in a long flowing gown that seemed to shimmer and waver like mist. Her hair was long, black as night, falling over her face like a veil. And her eyes, those eyes, were pure black, empty voids that seemed to devour the light. Ethan's heart stopped. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The woman didn't move. She simply stood there, watching him with those empty, suffocating eyes. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come here, Ethan." Her voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a blade. Ethan took a step back, his legs trembling beneath him. There was something so wrong about her presence. She was not Sophia, and yet the name felt right. "Who are you?" Ethan managed to croak. The figure didn't answer right away. She simply tilted her head, as if amused by his question, as if she already knew the answer. "I am the one who waits," she finally said, her voice like a whisper in the dark. "I am the one who sees, and I am the one who listens." Ethan's mind raced. Something about her, something in her words, rang with a truth that was both terrifying and familiar. He felt an awful sense of déjà vu, as if this conversation had happened before. As if this had all been written. The woman took a step forward, and Ethan froze. The ground beneath him trembled slightly as though something was waking, something ancient. The shadows pressed closer. "You came here for answers, Ethan," she said. "But there are no answers in the dark, only echoes, only the things you left behind." Ethan's mind screamed. The darkness, the mirror, the figure. It was all closing in. He couldn't breathe. His vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented, and the woman's face twisted, melted into something monstrous. The shadows devoured her, and all that was left was the laughter, the echoes of his past. Sophia's voice, his own voice, and the twisted reflection, echoed in his mind, louder now. The silence crushed beneath the weight of their meaning. And then, in that crushing silence, a voice whispered, "You're not meant to escape, Ethan." The walls of his mind trembled as the darkness closed in on him. Chapter 10. The Final Descent. Ethan felt the weight of the darkness pressing into him, suffocating his thoughts, his breath. The shadowy woman, the thing that looked like Sophia, stood before him, her black eyes boring into his very soul. The silence that followed her chilling words was unbearable, a cold void where no sound, no movement, could escape. The air felt thick, laden with something ancient and unknowable, something wrong. He wanted to run. He wanted to tear himself away from this place, to escape the suffocating grip of the shadows and that terrible mirror that had shown him things he was not ready to see. But his legs wouldn't move. The ground beneath him felt as if it had merged with the darkness, roots of black tendrils curling up from the earth, binding him in place. "You are not meant to escape, Ethan," the shadow whispered again. And this time, it was not just her voice. It was an echo, a chorus. Hundreds of voices, twisted and distorted, all chanting the same words, reverberating through the void. Ethan's head throbbed. The world around him blurred, shifting like oil on water, impossible to focus on. He clenched his fists, but it did nothing to quell the suffocating pressure in his chest, the overwhelming weight of his own guilt. Memories, dark, fractured memories, began to surface. Sophia, her face pale, her eyes hollow and desperate, the screams, the blood. "Stop it," he whispered, shaking his head. He didn't want to remember. Not now, not here. But the memories came flooding in anyway. And with them, the realization. He had been the one to put her there. The words clung to him, suffocating, drowning. Sophia wasn't the one who needed to escape. It was him. It always had been. This was his prison. His making. You never understood, did you, Ethan? The voice spoke again, deeper now, laden with ancient sorrow and rage. The figure in front of him began to change, her form shifting like smoke, becoming something far more monstrous. Her face stretched, her eyes bulging, dark veins spiderwebbing across her skin as her lips twisted into a grotesque, hollow smile. I was never the one trapped, she hissed. You were. You always were. And then, the shadow collapsed in on itself, becoming a mass of writhing tendrils that reached for him, pulling him toward the mirror. Ethan tried to fight, but it was futile. The more he resisted, the more the tendrils seemed to dig into his skin, dragging him closer to the glass. The mirror, his reflection, beckoned him. He felt the coldness of the mirror touch his skin, and with it, a surge of memories. Fragments, broken and bleeding, the faces of the people he had left behind. His family, his friends, Sophia, all staring at him, not with hatred, but with pity. And as the tendrils pulled him in, he heard their voices, soft at first, like whispers, but growing louder and louder until they were a deafening roar in his mind. Why, Ethan? They asked in unison. Why did you leave us? He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He was drowning in the guilt. He was suffocating beneath the weight of his actions. The mirror rippled, distorting his reflection. His face morphed before his eyes, changing into something unrecognizable. His features warped into an older version of himself, eyes hollow and sunken, a mouth stretched into a cruel, mocking grin. But even that face, the one staring back at him, seemed wrong, a warped echo of something that wasn't truly him. I never meant for this to happen, he gasped, but the words felt hollow in his mouth, slipping through his lips like smoke. I never meant... The mirror seemed to mock him, reflecting all the lies he had told himself, all the excuses he had made. There was no escape from the truth, not in this place, not in the face of the reflection that stared back at him. And then, something shifted. The glass of the mirror shattered, not into pieces, but into the darkness itself. The shards flew outward, slicing the air, cutting through the silence. The tendrils that had once held him loosened, their grip weakening. The shadowy figure, now no longer just a woman, but a hideous amalgamation of all his sins, wailed in agony as she was pulled into the void. The walls of the chamber began to collapse, falling apart as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the darkness began to swallow him whole. It was as though the very ground beneath him was dissolving, the shadows creeping in from every angle, devouring the space around him. In that moment, time itself seemed to bend, stretching, warping, like a dream slipping through his fingers. And then he saw it. A figure. It stood at the farthest corner of the void, where the darkness seemed most impenetrable. A silhouette, barely visible, but unmistakable. Sophia. She was standing still, her eyes locked onto his. Her once beautiful face was now ashen, her body gaunt, her features obscured by shadows. But even as the void seemed to close in on her, even as the world itself began to crumble, her gaze held something Ethan had not seen before. Forgiveness. It was the strangest thing. In all the years he had spent running, hiding from the memories, the guilt, the darkness, there it was, an image of peace, of understanding. Sophia wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking vengeance. She was simply there, waiting. And somehow, in that moment, Ethan understood. He understood that this place, this hell he had trapped himself in, wasn't a punishment. It was a reflection of his own soul. He wasn't being judged by some external force. No, this was his own reckoning, his own reflection of guilt and regret. The darkness was not the enemy. It was simply the consequence of his choices. He had made it. He had created it. And now it was time to face it. With a deep, ragged breath, Ethan took a step forward. His legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone, but he couldn't stop. He had to move. He had to face her. He had to face himself. The shadowy tendrils continued to swirl around him, but they no longer felt threatening. Instead, they felt familiar. Like old wounds being reopened, the scars from his past finally showing their true form. Sophia's eyes softened as he drew closer, her figure becoming clearer with every step he took. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words falling from his lips like a prayer. The reflection, the woman, the shadows, all of it began to fade. The darkness started to recede slowly, as if it were being absorbed by the light. And in that moment, Ethan realized something. The only way to escape this place was to forgive himself. The last of the shadows dissolved as he stood before Sophia's figure. She reached out, her hand trembling, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something. Hope. And then, with a final breath, the world collapsed around them. The darkness consumed everything, pulling them into the void. But Ethan wasn't afraid. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid.